we should start now.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
Tanvi, any questions from yesterday before we start today's part?
Uh,
So there are no questions yet. We'll address whatever they ask in the chat box by the end of the session.
Okay. Because yesterday's talk was a bit exhaustive and there was no real way to make it clinical or easy or interesting because it was all related to transplant immunology.
Correct, sir.
And the students have no choice but to just, remember our basics of fundamentals of microbiology and immunology to understand that talk. I mean, if at all I was to summarize what we spoke yesterday, I will just say 3 or 4 sentences before I get into today's presentation. So first and foremost, in immunity, whenever they ask you about immunology, first thing you have to understand, is it innate immunity or acquired immunity? The second thing, when we talk about transplant, we have to understand where the patient comes from. So to us, it is important whether the patient is sensitized or non-sensitized. Okay, so sensitized means the 3 events: pregnancy, blood transfusion, and previous transplants. If none of them have been done, then it's very unlikely that your patient has any anti-HLA antibodies. So history taking is very important. Once you know whether the patient is sensitized or not, then the next question is, what test can you do to find out if the patient has been sensitized? And the answer to that is, for a general inexpensive screening test, you will do a PRA, that is the panel reactive antibody. That will tell you whether the patient has any anti-human leukocyte antigen, anti-HLA antibodies against other human being antigens in the general population. That is a screening test. If the screening test is positive, you do the specific test. And what is that? It is the DSA, the donor specific antibody. So when you know who is the donor, you can do it against the potential donor, right? The next is, now you know where your patient is coming from, whether the patient is immunologically sensitized or not sensitized in history, and immunologically sensitized or not sensitized based on tests. Then comes the last test, and that is to do a cross match. Now, when it comes to cross match, what are we talking? We are talking about antibodies that are in sufficient concentration in the patient that when we put in a new kidney, that can get damaged. So the old test, which we still use commonly, is the CDC test. That is the complement dependent cytotoxicity test. And the modification which we commonly use in labs today is the CDC-AHG. That is complement dependent cytotoxicity augmented human globulin. Okay, so it is a CDC-AHG test, which we all use in practice. When you do a transplant and you do a cross match, this is what is actually done. Okay, if you want to be more specific, if your patient say had some history of transfusions or has high PRA, you want to be more specific, then which test will you do? The flow cross match. The flow cross match I showed you yesterday, that the flow cross match is able to detect much lesser titers, lesser quantities of antibody present. Also, it is more specific because it is not using complement. It is using another human globulin and a flow mechanism to make sure whether there are any antibodies present in the recipient against the donor. And the last thing I showed you yesterday was the solid phase immunoassay, also called as ELISA or Luminex platform. And what did I show you there? That it is a synthetic platform where you use beads. Beads are like small glass beads, right? They are coated, these microspheres are coated with specific antigens. Either it could be single antigen bead where the antigen is coated with the same antigen, that bead is coated with the same antigen, or it could be multiple antigens on the same bead, which is the less expensive variant. And here again, you do the same. So across all tests, the principle is the same. You have serum, which will contain the antibody, you mix it with the antigen, and you read the test. So that was in a nutshell the summary of whatever we tried to speak yesterday when it came to immunology. Because I was requested by a few of you to go over that before I started today. So this was what we actually already discussed. This is the most important single slide from yesterday's talk, the signal 1, signal 2, signal 3, because this is showing you the action for each and every drug that we are talking today. Part 2, what we did yesterday, we did a basic evaluation of donor and recipient. And we went over what would make us choose between different, the recipient and the donor. The virtual cross-match, I think I explained in detail yesterday. It is a computer-based algorithm, right? Okay. So all this we did yesterday. Then we came yesterday to this, which we'll revise in brief because we have gone over the induction agents yesterday. What I was trying to show you yesterday is that basically there are two types of classes of drugs when it comes to different drugs. There are basically two classes of drugs. One is the small molecules, and the second is a protein drug. So when it comes to the way I would like to remember it is induction agents and maintenance agents. So when it comes to induction agents, it's basically antibodies. They are either depleting in nature or non-depleting in nature. Depleting means reducing the number of cells, right? And non-depleting means just modifying the function, not really destroying the cell. So in the protein antibodies, you see the depleting antibodies. The commonest one used is the rabbit anti-thymocyte globulin. Horse we don't use much, right? The OKT3 or the anti-CD3 or the Muromonab CD3 as it was called, again, was very strong antibody against CD3, but it is not as commonly used because it is a mouse antibody and it will cause a second dose reaction sometimes. Campath, not available in our country, but fairly commonly used in a lot of centers in the US. Rituximab will go over. These are the induction agents. Anti-lymphocyte antibodies. What are they? Polyclonal and monoclonal. Polyclonal is thymoglobulin, which is commonly used, the rabbit thymoglobulin. ADGAM is horse-based thymoglobulin. Monoclonal antibody, such as Campath or alemtuzumab, anti-CD52, and OKT3 is the anti-CD3. The second is the interleukin-2 receptor antibody, which is also a blockade of signal 3 in that figure that we showed you. So there are two drugs, basiliximab and daclizumab. Daclizumab has been withdrawn from practice. So practically there's only one drug, basiliximab. And anti-CD20 antibodies are rituximab. Now, how all this that we went through, how does it help us? Low risk, high risk, that PRA less than 20, more than 20. It helps us choose the induction agents for our transplants. So in a high-risk patient, we can give injection anti-thymocyte globulin as an induction to decrease the risk of rejection. And in the low-risk patient, we will use a anti-interleukin. So we would use this one, the IL-2 receptor antibody, basiliximab. And when you really want only B cell function to be affected, so you don't want too much of antibodies to be formed, you can use rituximab. So we use it very commonly in the ABO incompatible transplants. So I have been doing the ABO incompatible transplants for the last 12 years now, and it's now become a fairly routine affair. And we use a lot of rituximab in these patients to decrease the production of B cell based antibodies. So the anti-blood group antibodies, we would normally use it around weeks prior to transplant. These are the different induction agents. And in maintenance, the current standard of care is to use triple drug immunosuppression. So triple drug means one calcineurin inhibitor, either a tacrolimus or cyclosporin, one anti-proliferative agent. So there are three choices: mycophenolate, mTOR inhibitors, or azathioprine. And last is steroids. Now let us go over each of the drugs in a bit specific detail, since it may come as a question, right? So suppose the question is rabbit anti-thymocyte globulin. How does it work? So mechanism of action is the depletion of thymus produced lymphocytes. Any of the lymphocytes which will contain these markers, CD2, 3, 4, 8, 11A and 18, they could be destroyed by different mechanisms like complement-based lysis, opsonization. What is opsonization? Antibody eating up the molecule. That is opsonization. And phagocytosis, where the cell takes over the function of the antibody and eats the stuff. As it is so potent, it has a severe post-dose reaction, which can manifest with fever, with chills, joint pains, hypotension in severe cases. So that's like a SIRS. How we see in SIRS, inflammatory response syndrome, that kind of a reaction. Because of cell destruction, this is mediated. Thrombophlebitis, peripheral vein thrombosis, if it is given through a peripheral vein, so preferably given through a central vein, right? Longer, like shorter term side effects over days would be for a drop in the WBC and the platelet count, so leukopenia and thrombocytopenia. And a severe thrombocytopenia, platelet count less than 50,000 would be an absolute indication to stop the drug. Leukopenia less than 4,000, again a warning sign. Leukopenia less than 3,000 or any absolute neutrophil less than 1,000, please stop the drug immediately. Few cases, but anaphylaxis is possible. It's it's basically derived from other species, right? So that is possible. Infections, the risk of infection goes up because your mechanism, body's innate immunity is affected when you destroy these cells. So infection risk goes up. And PTLD or post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders can go up because of this particular drug. How do you use the drug? Commonest used dose is 1.5 milligram per kilogram given as an infusion over 4 to 8 hours. And we should always use pre-medication with steroids and an antihistaminic prior to giving this injection. So how many doses would you end up giving for this particular drug? So normally you will see in practice, internationally they would use around 5 to 6 doses. The recommended dose is to reach at least 6 milligram per kilogram. In India, in patients, you will see most of us ending maximum 3 milligram per kilogram. Beyond that, hardly you would see people using ATG because the tolerance is not so good and severe side effects in the form of low WBC and platelet counts is very common. Okay. The next drug in our list is alemtuzumab, also called as Campath. It's a humanized antibody, monoclonal again, rat IgG1, direct against CD52 cell surface antigen. What is CD52? This is an antigen which is expressed on T cells, B cells, natural killer cells, and monocytes. So a lot of our effector arms of the immunity, right? They are carrying this antigen. So any cells with this antigen is basically targeted and destroyed. So it results in depletion of these cell populations. And this would be used for induction and treatment of steroid-resistant rejection, also in solid organ transplant. So these drugs can be used as induction agents. They can also be used as rescue agents in severe rejections which are not responding to steroids alone. Side effects quite similar to ATG: fever, chills, hypotension, pulmonary edema. In Campath, the autoimmune phenomena have been also described, such as thyroid disease, hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia. Particularly in patients with multiple sclerosis, these phenomena have been observed more in these patients. Tocilizumab is your interleukin-2 receptor antibody. So it is a chimeric antibody, so human and mouse chimera. So it is expressed on activated CD25 is something that is expressed on activated T cells. So it prevents interleukin-2 from binding to its receptor and thereby inhibits T cell proliferation and differentiation, but does not cause depletion of these T cells. So ATG is mostly used for high-risk patients, whereas basiliximab is a good option for low-risk patients. Few adverse events are reported, and some patients can have hypersensitivity reactions to this drug also. Daclizumab is actually a humanized monoclonal antibody, again similar mechanism of action. It was actually initially licensed for multiple sclerosis, but it has been withdrawn world over because of some reports of serious inflammatory brain disorders. I've used it, in the early to like maybe 15-20 years back. We were using this drug, but now it is no longer available. The next drug in our list is rituximab. So rituximab is a monoclonal antibody against CD20. Now CD20 is a B cell marker. It is present on all B cells except for plasma cells. So remember, important thing here, plasma cells are they're autonomous. They will keep on forming new antibodies once they are formed. And the B cells, when there is clonal proliferation of B cell, they proliferate to become a plasma cell. So even though the plasma cells are derived from B cells, once they become autonomous, they are no longer subject to the same regulatory mechanisms that applies to other B cells in our body. So the plasma cells are special, and drugs that work against plasma cells are drugs like bortezomib, which we might just glance over. But basically, plasma cells, rituximab will not work if patient is already having a plasma cell clone against making a particular antibody, and you might not get the desired effect with this drug in such situations. So where is the indication for using rituximab? So when your patient has an antibody mediated rejection, AMR, whether it is in acute, definitely in chronic, also the role is there for decreasing the antibody mediated rejection. ABO incompatible transplant, like I shared with you, we would use it to reduce the formation of the anti-blood group antibodies and desensitization of the HLA sensitive patients. So when we say of HLA sensitized patients, high PRAs, now how do you prepare or how do you kind of desensitize them? Then rituximab is one of the drugs, along with IVIG and plasma exchange and sometimes even thymoglobulin, that have been used in different protocols to achieve desensitization, which meaning removal of the anti-HLA antibodies from the patient's sera so that they become a good recipient prospectively. Side effects with rituximab, similar. Infusion-related side effects are more or less same to all the antibodies that we use. Fever, chills, hypotension, joint pains, arthralgias, tachycardias, everything is quite similar. Long-term, see, this is not so common to see leukopenia or neutropenia, but it has been described. And because you're targeting antibody production, theoretically you can get A-gamma globulinemia. So absence of gamma globulins, it will increase your risk of getting infection. So these were our induction agents. Now we'll come to the drugs that we use in our triple immunosuppression in the maintenance protocol. So steroids. Now steroids is the first drug that has been used in transplantation. Even when people were doing primarily radiation and splenectomy, they were still using high-dose steroids to do a successful transplant. They have a significant effect on T cell proliferation. They block the interleukin-2 production. They also prevent the induction of interleukin-1 and interleukin-6 genes in the macrophage. They are also the strongest anti-inflammatory agent, and this activity mediates the inhibition of migration of monocytes to areas of inflammation. Do you use it in transplant? At the time of transplant, you use it as an anti-induction for the same mechanisms that we spoke about. So normally I use around 500 milligrams on the day of the transplant, and then subsequently we use 1 milligram per kilogram on day 1, and then it's tapered. At the end of 2 to 3 months, we are down to 5 to 10 milligrams per day. Stopping steroids, I do not ascribe to as a personal experiences, but it leads to increased risk of graft rejection. So all these protocols which speak of steroid avoidance, early steroid withdrawal, they sound very great, because like I am going to show you the side effects of steroids, you will all wish that we used steroid-free protocols. But the risk of acute rejection or the risk of graft loss goes up by almost 10% in these patients when you read the fine print over a 3 to 5 year period, and that is significant in our population. So one patient out of 10 losing kidney because you are not giving him steroids, something to think about. Side effects, like I said, there are lots of them. So if you ever ask a patient which is the one transplant that you want me to stop without, if I was to promise you that there would be no side effects, so please tell me which drug I can stop. Only one drug. They'll always tell steroids. Why? Because in younger patients particularly, and the Cushingoid phases, so the looks change. So patients are very unhappy because they don't look good up to themselves in the mirror. Poor wound healing, because the effect on the dermis is well known. Growth retardation, particularly when you're doing it in younger children who have not yet reached puberty. The transplants, you would like to use less steroids to prevent growth retardation. Diabetes, hyperlipidemia, bone disease. I mean, AVN particularly is one of the worst ones in addition to your osteoporosis. AVN or avascular necrosis is unpredictable, and when it happens, it causes quite significant morbidity to the patient, and even requires sometimes joint replacements. Particularly for the hip, it is very more common than others. The next, I think, in order is shoulder, but hip is the worst one that we come in practice. And obesity, yes. Hypertension, psychiatric disturbance, very important. Patients with any past history of psychiatric disturbance, giving steroids is a nightmare. Cataracts, pancreatitis. Now in pancreatitis particularly, we need to be understanding that patients with chronic pancreatitis, It is challenging to use steroids. Also, it is challenging to use mycophenolate mofetil. So these patients are very difficult to transplant. Skin changes and the peptic ulcers, we are not seeing so many of them with the PPI that is in regular use now, proton pump inhibitors. But peptic ulceration previously was one of the very worried side effects. So the list of side effects is very big with steroid. And that comes as a question in itself. What are the side effects of steroids and why would you want to use the steroid avoidance protocol in transplantation? So this would be an exhaustive list which can be detailed upon. So next drug is cyclosporin. So cyclosporin is specific. Now cyclosporin is about signal 1. So what does cyclosporin do? It binds to cyclophilin, which is cytoplasmic protein. What is cyclophilin doing? Cyclophilin is important for inhibition of calcineurin. Okay, so that is why they are called as calcineurin inhibitors. Cyclosporin binds to cyclophilin, inhibits calcineurin. What does calcineurin do? It is a serine protease. It is responsible for converting NFAT to the active form. So NFAT is nuclear factor of activated T cells. When it is converted to the active form, it is responsible for synthesizing mRNA and causing the T cell response. So if you are going to block NFAT from becoming active, so the activation is by phosphorylation. You inhibit the phosphorylation, NFAT is not active, T cell is not proliferating. Okay, so that is what cyclosporin does. It blocks the calcineurin and it prevents activation of NFAT to active NFAT. Same for tacrolimus that way. The nuclear translocation of the dephosphorylated or the active NFAT in association with other transcription factors, it initiates the downstream events leading to T cell activation. The CNIs also suppress the immune response by calcineurin independent pathways, likely by blocking intracellular specific signals for T cells. That is all non-specific. Most important is blocking the calcineurin. How do we use cyclosporin? Cyclosporin is used commonly in twice-a-day dosage. The one we use in practice for the last 15-20 years now is Neoral, which is the microemulsion. It is much more consistent in its bioavailability, and that's why it is kind of used all over. It is to be given as twice a day dose, 12 hours apart. The normal dosing is 5 to 10 milligram per kilogram twice a day. The level cyclosporin level is commonly available, and that is used to guide how much cyclosporin to use. Previously, we used to use the trough levels, what is also referred to as the C0. But for the last 15-20 years, C2 is defined as the line of care, and C2 is the best predictor of the AUC for cyclosporin, the area under the curve. And so cyclosporin level at exactly 120 minutes after the ingestion of the dose predicts the bioavailability of cyclosporin the best, and that is used as for monitoring of cyclosporin. So with C2, you target levels where you want. So in the first 3 months, you will try to target on the higher side, closer to 800 to 1000, and after 3 months, you'll in the maintenance phase, you like to keep it closer to 600 in most patients. Also depends on individual how they are using it. Remember, cyclosporin was a drug that changed the face of transplantation and made it acceptable to the common man, because it was only after cyclosporin was introduced that it became absolutely clear that transplant is superior to dialysis for both survival and quality of life issues. Okay, so cyclosporin was a big development in the 90s in the field of transplantation. What are the side effects of cyclosporin? It's a two-edged sword. It causes nephrotoxicity based on hemodynamic toxicity. So calcineurin is a vasoconstrictor molecule, and nephrotoxicity is fairly common. There was an Australian trial by Jeremy Chapman and colleagues. I think the first author is Brian Kaplan. So this was a trial looking at simultaneous pancreas and kidney transplant. So young, donors, very good kidneys at the time of donation, deceased donors. And when they were followed up to 10 years with periodic biopsies, so they were just doing biopsies regularly to look for looking for subclinical rejections. And what they actually saw over a 10-year period in these patients is that almost 90% of them developed some degree of calcineurin toxicity. So that is how common nephrotoxicity is in these patients. The other toxicities are hepatotoxicity, and that is why you will always look at us monitoring for the liver enzymes and bilirubin, particularly SGOT-PT goes up much commonly in this toxicity. Increased risk of lymphomas, but that is over a longer period of time. So with cyclosporin and tacrolimus, particularly cyclosporin, with tacrolimus, hypertrichosis is more common, nausea, anorexia. On the kidney, it causes the side effect of hyperkalemia and magnesium wasting. So hypomagnesemia is common with high potassium. Other side effects that are important are tremors. So you always see the man looking for tremors at rest. Convulsions, usually secondary to press or sometimes a direct side effect of the cyclosporin. And paresthesia is in the hand or the feet. So whenever they are getting cyclosporin toxicity, you will see them complaining of paresthesias in the hands and the limbs, worsening tremors, elevated BP, high potassium, rising creatinine, and that is how cyclosporin toxicity manifests. Treatment would be to check the level, document the toxicity, and reduce the dose to be taken care of. Other side effects, like I mentioned, hypertension, metabolic side effects, it can cause hyperlipidemia. Gingival hypertrophy is very important with cyclosporin. People on cyclosporin for many years, you will see that the gums are really hypertrophied to the point of bleeding on touch. The other drug that causes this is your blood pressure medicine, nifedipine, right? Yeah. And ABO, autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So these are uncommon side effects which are also seen with cyclosporin. Tacrolimus is very similar. It is also called as FK binding protein, FK506. It is derived from a fungus in Japan, and it inhibits the T cell lymphocyte activation by binding to the FK binding protein 12, which is an intracellular protein, and it forms a complex with the FK binding protein, calcium, calmodulin, and ultimately inhibits calcineurin. So it does the same thing in a different way. It does not work through the cyclophilin, it works through FK binding protein. The final effect is same, binding with calmodulin and inhibiting calcineurin. Okay, so downstream all the effects are same for tacrolimus and cyclosporin. So same blockage of the end fat, no major difference. Side effects very similar, nephrotoxicity, reduced because of reduced blood flow to the kidney. Like I said, it's a vasoconstrictive agent, so there is reduced glomerular perfusion, tubular toxicity, vascular toxicity, neurotoxicity, headaches, tremors, seizures, neuropathies. They have all been shown. Metabolic disturbances similar, high potassium, low magnesium, hyperchloremic acidosis. Diabetes is more common with tacrolimus than with cyclosporin. Hyperuricemia is also common, high cholesterol, hypertension. So they share most of the side effects. The couple of things I would like to tell you, gingival hyperplasia is commoner with cyclosporin. Hypertrichosis is commoner with cyclosporin. Diabetes is commoner with tacrolimus. So the PTDM or the post-transplant diabetes, you'll see more in patients with tacrolimus than you'll see on cyclosporin. GI disturbances, again more common with tacrolimus. One of the things is it causes enterohepatic circulation of MMF. Increased enterohepatic circulation of MMF, which increases the blood levels of MMF or mycophenolate mofetil, leads to GI side effects in the form of diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, epigastric cramping. Tacrolimus actually causes hair loss, so alopecia is common. PTDM, I explained to you, diabetes is serious adverse event. How do we use it? Well, tacrolimus is again used as a twice a day dose, and most patients you will see it's around 0.1 milligram per kilogram. In divided doses 0.1 to 0.2. And again, here instead of using T2, we use T0 or the trough level because that is the standard of care. And the trough cyclotacrolimus levels are usually targeted in new transplants between 8 and 12. And as we use as a maintenance drug, you will target it between 5 and 8. Okay, so the drug levels help us decide how much of this tacrolimus to give to a patient individually. Okay, so after the calcineurin, the next drug in our list is mycophenolate mofetil. Mycophenolate mofetil is an anti-proliferative agent. It is converted to the active form, which is the mycophenolic acid. So mycophenolic acid causes rapid, reversible, non-competitive inhibition of an enzyme, which is important in the synthesis of guanine. So guanine, as you know, is one of the building blocks of the DNA. And this enzyme is called as IMPDH. It's inosine monophosphate dehydrogenase. It's one of the enzymes in the purine synthesis. So if you stop in a synthesis of guanine, you arrest new DNA synthesis in the proliferating cells. So that would lead to the GTP or levels decreasing to 10% of those in unstimulated T cells. So now your T cells are unable to manifest a response. Initial trials with mycophenolate in the European patients were all on 3 grams per day. The Asian patients, most of the trials are at the dose of 2 grams per day. So you will see most of us using it in the dose of 2 grams per day when we are using with cyclosporin. And when we are using with tacrolimus, you can even use 1.5 gram per day. That is because of the intrahepatic circulation of MMF is increased on tacrolimus than with other drugs. Side effects, like I explained to you when I was explaining TAC, is diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, cramping, gastroesophageal reflux. Now, because of its antiproliferative effect, you are going to see low hemoglobin, low platelets, low WBC. Better avoided in COVID-19 pandemic because of its antiproliferative effect. That being said, now that we are routinely transplanting patients in the COVID-19 pandemic, we are using MMF, but monitoring the WBC count fairly closely. It is a problem because the side effects include significant viral infections. And in transplant, when we say viral infections, there are 3 common and important viruses. It is the CMV or the cytomegalovirus. It is the HSV or the herpes simplex and zoster virus, which causes shingles in our patients, and BK virus. That is the nephrotoxicity because of the BK virus. So these are the important things to look for. Increase in the incidence of lymphoma, cough, dyspnea, and abundant sputum production. So this is an uncommon side effect, but sometimes it can be really annoying because people can get a lot of nasal stuffiness and some patients can get productive cough and it just will not go till you withdraw the drug. So, after the MMF, the next drug that I'm going to talk to you about in the line of antiproliferatives is the mTOR inhibitor. mTOR inhibitor, the one that came, the old one which we are still using in practice is sirolimus, which is derived again from a fungus like tacrolimus was. And everolimus is a synthetic drug. It was derived in the lab by some substitutions in the sirolimus structure, and it was helped create a molecule with better oral bioavailability. So even sirolimus is good, but everolimus is has better bioavailability. What does mTOR inhibitors do? A mammalian target of rapamycin. So if you remember that the same figure, then you remember between signal 2 and signal 3, and after the signal 3 also, there were this target of rapamycin, which is important for cell proliferation and division. So mTOR binds to one of the family of the immunophilins called FK506 binding proteins. The sirolimus and the FK binding protein or the everolimus FK binding protein complexes with the mTOR, which then it blocks protein synthesis effectively. So blockade of the mTOR results in inactivation of certain molecules, which inhibit the interleukin-2 transcription. Now, interleukin-2 we all know is a proliferating signal for T cells. So anything that is blocking the interleukin-2 transcription by whatever downstream mechanisms, it will ultimately lead to reduction in the T cell response. So it arrests the cell cycle in the late G1 phase. What is special for these class of drugs that in spite of being anti-proliferative agents, in the lab, they have been shown to have great antiviral effects. Particularly, there are some things about mTOR that I must mention when it comes to clinical practice. One is it reduces the incidence of PTLD or the post-transplant lymphoproliferative disease. So particularly when you're transplanting, say, across EBV mismatch, now that would happen with teenage patients getting a kidney from their parents or a younger child getting a kidney. And when you're transplanting them, you will be worried about EBV infections later in life manifesting with PTLD. And there, using a drug like this will have a lot of value. A reduction in Kaposi sarcoma has been shown with this group of drugs. What is interesting is that when used in patients with kidney failure related to ADPKD, you actually find that the native kidney shrinks over a period of time when they remain on these drugs. Okay, so like I mentioned to you, the important three things that I would like you to remember in addition to the routine is decreased incidence of PTLD, decreased incidence of Kaposi sarcoma, which is again a viral infection, HHV8, and a reduced incidence of, like I said, in ADPKD, it causes shrinkage of the cystic kidney. The native kidneys actually shrink when you are on this drug for transplantation. So this drug was actually used in ADPKD before the TEMPO trial for tolvaptan. Now that is kind of become the standard of care because this has a lot of side effects. And what side effects am I referring to? Look at the list. Hypertriglyceridemia, hypercholesterolemia, very difficult to control when you are on these drugs. Hyperglycemia, not so common, but it can sometimes even cause an ITDM. Liver toxicity manifested with a rise in ALT. Hypokalemia, hypophosphatemia with a hyperuricemia, that is a metabolic defect with sirolimus. And hematological, it will present with anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia. So having a patient on, say, MMF, sirolimus, and steroid is a nightmare, because when you are using MMF and this sirolimus together, the combined anti-proliferative effect causes a severe anemia, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, making it very difficult to use these drugs together. So the standard of care involves a calcineurin with one anti-proliferative and a steroid for this reason. Okay. The other things which are important are CMV, herpes simplex, candidiasis, PCP infections. Even they have their own, auto kind of lung injury, which can be seen with sirolimus per se. Urinary tract infections are common. Infections, wound healing. That was one of the big problems when we started using this drug. Because initially when you use this drug, the wounds would just not heal. The incidence of lymphocytes was high, and the incidence of delayed wound healing and secondary suturing required was very significant. And that is how everybody learned that you should not use this drug till wound healing is complete. So if possible, do not use de novo. Better to introduce a bit late once wound healing is complete. And that is a better time to use this drug. Monitoring of the drug is fairly simple. It is to be used. So sirolimus is once a day dosing, whereas everolimus can be used as twice a day. Drug levels are fairly easily available, and monitoring the drug dose can help us to target the level between 5 to 8 is where we likely keep it. But when you are using in combination with the calcineurin, you target it lower, between 3 and 5, because there is a interaction at the level of the tissue. That is called as a pharmacodynamic interaction between this group of drugs and your calcineurin inhibitors. So when you're using these two drugs in common, you should target the drug levels on the lower side. Into the next drug, that is azathioprine. Now, azathioprine is a thiopurine. What does that mean? It is, it is a derivative of mercaptopurine. So it is basically, it just blocks purine synthesis and it inhibits the DNA RNA synthesis. Now it is non-specific. Now MMF was doing a similar thing, but it was specific. In that sense, it was inhibiting an enzyme called as IMPDH, which is present only in lymphocytes, predominantly. Whereas when you just use something which blocks DNA RNA synthesis by blocking all purine synthesis in the body, you are going to get affection of all cell lines. Whereas MMF is supposed technically to block only IMPDH and block only the lymphocytes. However, what is seen in practice is it also causes depletion of all cell lines, but not as bad as azathioprine. Azathioprine is very strong and it will just block all lymphocyte proliferation and decrease the IL-2 production. We normally use this as a single daily dose between 1.5 to 2.5 milligram per kilogram per day is a standard dose. Drug levels are not available, so the adjustment is based on measurement of the WBC and the platelet count. As long as they are stable and there is no hepatotoxicity, we use the drug. Advantage is that it is inexpensive, fairly affordable, and it's a very good antiproliferative when there are no side effects. The major side effect, like I explained to you, is bone marrow suppression. So bone marrow aplasia, commonly manifested as leukopenia. In more severe cases, it can cause anemia and thrombocytopenia as well. So when the leukocyte count is less than 3,000, That is when the azathioprine dose should be reduced. And the anemia that you see with azathioprine is a megaloblastic anemia. Okay, that we need to remember. The other important toxicity, what I mentioned, was liver injuries, that is hepatotoxicity. Alopecia is there. Squamous cell cancer increase, even though no evidence is available. Now, if you see these old transplants, from the 70s and 80s, who did very well for like 25, 30 years, you'll see them having a lot of skin problems. And maybe it is because of azathioprine prolonged use that these patients get skin problems, and incidence of skin cancers is particularly high on this drug. Leukocyte count is monitored and the dose is to be adjusted if leukopenia arises. The next drug that I am discussing is a fusion inhibitor. Now, this is actually a new concept called as co-stimulatory blockade. So we had drugs blocking signal 1. We had drugs, so we know that when T cell, where the antigen is presented, there is a co-stimulation that is required to, make the response bigger. This co-stimulation is by manifest. One of the mechanisms of co-stimulation is CTLA4 Ig. And if you have a fusion protein which composed of the modified extracellular domain of the cytotoxic T lymphocyte associated protein 4, or also called as CTLA4, the easier way to remember that, and the Fc domain of humanized IgG1. So it blocks co-stimulation by binding to the CD80 and 86 receptors on the antigen presenting cells. Short to summarize, remember it is an antibody monoclonal which will block the T cell response by binding to certain receptors 80 and 86 on the antigen presenting cells. It has to be used in combination with other immunosuppression as maintenance therapy. The big thing with belatacept is that it was actually promoted as a calcineurin-free immunosuppression. So don't use calcineurin. Use belatacept in addition to the standard of care was Similac or basiliximab. And belatacept was to be used as monthly injections in these patients along with your MMF and steroid. And that trial is still ongoing for long-term follow-ups. And they are showing that patients are doing well on belatacept. The problem is getting them once to the hospital every month. So if it's a local patient, it's doable, but if it's a patient from outstation, it's very hard to put them on certain drugs. And the relative benefits are not that pronounced. See, the relative benefits has to be really pronounced for us to do something like this, which is expensive and once a month, because even though we say calcineurin nephrotoxicity is common, clinical nephrotoxicity that would make us withdraw the drug or reduce it to a point where it is ineffective is not as common. Okay. Side effects of this particular drug, the worst side effect is increased incidence of PTLD or post-transplant lymphoproliferative disease. The other side effects are dyslipidemia, hypertension, and bone marrow suppression. Okay, so this is where I stopped the session on drugs. And just to summarize, induction and maintenance. Induction, monoclonal antibodies, and polyclonal. So there are two types, either a depleting antibody or a non-depleting. High-risk patients, high PRA, sensitized patients use depleting antibody. Low-risk patient, good antigen match, a low risk in terms of your cross-matching, go ahead with basiliximab for induction. Would you use induction even if suppose patient has no sensitization and has a negative CDC and a negative flow? Not necessary. But if you use it, the advantage is you can use low dose of calcineurin and steroids. So the side effects will be less for the prolonged term, right? So that is why a lot of us use induction agents even in low risk patients. Anti-CD20 antibody for induction is for sensitized patients and for immunocompatible transplant. It is not to be used as a single drug. It is in addition to other agents. For maintenance, standard of care is triple drug immunosuppression. One of the calcineurin inhibitors, either cyclosporine or tacrolimus. One of the antiproliferative agents, either MMF, azathioprine, or sirolimus, or everolimus, the mTOR inhibitors. So one of these. So one of these three will be one of the regular antiproliferatives. Leflunomide is not commonly used in our country. The use of leflunomide as an antiproliferative is increasing. It is an pyrimidine inhibitor. it would also do similar things to what your MF would do by blocking the pyrimidine pathway. We are using it more now with the increased incidence of BK virus. Okay, so that is how leflunomide is being used, but that's one of the antiproliferative. And the last drug is steroid, which should be used in the lowest dose possible to decrease the incidence of side effects. Newer concepts, co-stimulatory blockade, which we went through. Okay, so these are all the drugs that we commonly used in transplant. The last part of our thing is now how to look after the patient in the early post-transplant period and how to manage the problems. So this is what we commonly do in clinical exam. You are monitoring the blood pressure, weight, urine output very frequently. Daily labs are done where we look at the RFT, LFT, drug monitoring of calcineurin as required, along with the CBC, prophylactic antibiotic till the drains and drug catheters are removed in most patients. Diet, I mean, we all start that once intestinal activity resumes. Starting with SEPs to liquid diet and then gradually increasing to full diet. Wound care, catheter, most of you remove it around between the 3rd and 5th day, and the drain. Physiotherapy and mobilization starts on the next day post-op. What are the complications that we'll have to deal with? The early complications. Early complications are of two types. One is surgical complication, which actually you are better to prepared to talk and discuss about than me. But the important ones that I would worry about is vascular thrombosis, urinary leaks, and bleeding complications. Medical complications, which I can discuss with you, are related to immunological effects, which are primarily acute rejection and delayed graft function. Delayed graft function we'll talk about, and acute rejection. These two are important. Late complications that we should know about, they are basically chronic allograft nephropathy, death with functioning graft, which is very common now. I don't know whether to be happy about it or not, but it is a difficult thing. It's a Hobson's choice. Infections, malignancies, and metabolic complications. So you can also divide your graft dysfunction in this kind of a way where you say immediate, early, and late. When you say immediate, it is a delayed function of the kidney, a DGF or an ATN. Now, delayed graft function is defined as a need of dialysis in the early post-transplant period. That is a absolute indication of definition of DGF or delayed graft function. Suppose the creatinine, normally you would expect the creatinine to reduce by 50% over a 48-hour period. If it does not reduce by 50% over a 48-hour period, it is called as slow graft function or SGF. ATN is a common hemodynamically mediated injury that is the pathological feature seen in patients with DGF or SGF. The other immediate complications that you would be worried about are vascular occlusion, the obstruction of the ureter, urinary leaks, atherombolism, which you will see with the plaques in the arteries sometimes. And the immunological one is hyperacute or accelerated rejection, which is very uncommon now with all the newer tissue typing and cross-matching methods which we are using to predict rejections before. So it's very uncommon. So DGF or slow graft function is much more common when the donor is a cadaveric or a deceased donor transplant because of the logistics and the increased cold ischemia time. In living donor kidney transplant, there are very infrequent to see a DGF or a slow graft function. The other complications, like I explained to you, are primarily surgical in nature in the immediate period, which can be discussed. The early complications are volume depletion. Now, volume depletion is very important. So how are you going to avoid volume depletion? You're going to keep the intake as the urine output plus insensible losses. So average insensible losses in the early post-transplant period are around, say, 500 ml a day. So your intake should be output plus 500 ml a day to avoid volume depletion. The other good judge for volume is daily weight of the patient. So if you know the dry weight of the patient on dialysis, then that will be the best surrogate to tell you whether the patient has volume depletion or not. Volume depletion is important because it will delay the renal recovery and cause increase in the BUN and creatinine early post-transplant. The second complication is acute calcineurin toxicity. Now I explained to you that it's a vasoconstrictor. So in higher doses, it can cause nephrotoxicity. And the other important side effect is neurotoxicity. In nephrotoxicity, it will manifest as hypertension, decreased renal blood flow causing decreased GFR and rise in creatinine, with electrolyte abnormalities like hyperkalemia, hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis with hypomagnesemia. So low magnesium, increased chloride with the metabolic acidosis, and high potassium are and high uric acid are the features that you will see metabolically in calcineurin toxicity. And neurological side effects will be tremors, headaches, and then paresthesias, and very severe cases, convulsions. So that is acute CNI toxicity for you. Obstruction or lymphocyte, again a surgical complication which you would not want to see, but lymphocytes are fairly common. Most of the dealing with a lymphocyte, I'm sure, will be a part of your surgical lecture. Rejections, early rejection. So the common time frame for an acute rejection in today's practice is around the 7-day mark. It's around the 7-day mark when you see an increase in creatinine, you start thinking of rejection, because because there are no preformed antibodies which you have detected in your test. So the antigen presenting cell, in face of all the major agents used, presenting the new kidney antigens to the immune system and manifesting a response, the usual time is around 7 days. And the commonest rejection seen is acute cellular rejection. Most of them are responsive to steroids. AMR can be seen if we have missed a load like any pre-existing antibodies or a memory response from the antibodies. In that case, the rejection will be more severe and it will be an antibody-mediated rejection, and it will not be easily responding to steroids, and you may need more treatment either in the form of plasma exchange or rituximab or even antithymocyte globulin to reverse the rejection. Thrombotic microangiopathy is a dreaded side effect in transplantation. Thrombotic microangiopathy manifests with worsening renal function. In the hematological picture, you're going to see a drop in HB, drop in platelets, along with schistocytes in the blood. So any patient with low HB, dropping platelets, rising creatinine, should think about TMA. You should look for LDH and schistocytes. If they are present, then you need to complete the evaluation and diagnose TMA. Common causes of TMA are either immunological in the form of acute rejection or drugs. Particularly drugs like calcineurin inhibitors are responsible for causing TMA, and in that case you will need to withdraw the calcineurin and use an alternative drug. BK virus is actually a bit usually seen after around 6 months, but sometimes can be seen early, particularly in retransplant cases. Recurrent glomerulonephritis. Now this is important. See, whenever you do a transplant, you want to know what is the cause of the primary graft loss. Why did the patient become a kidney patient in the first place? What is the native kidney disease? And why is that important at all? That is the reason why I insist on biopsies whenever possible in patients with failing kidneys. Because if you know the disease, then you can tell whether this disease can come back after a transplant. Now, when you look at IgA nephritis, it comes back in almost 90% of our transplant patients. However, it is clinically significant in only 10%. Whereas something like an FSGS would sometimes just come back in a very malignant fashion post-transplant with severe proteinuria and graft dysfunction, requiring plasma exchange and sometimes even leading to kidney loss. So knowing the primary disease is very important, particularly when the patient has a primary glomerulonephritis as the cause of kidney failure. So these are some of the acute complications, early complications. The late complications are primarily rejections, and most of them are, either because of non-compliance to medicines or because of non-monitoring of the medicine dose, or it could be also because of antibody-mediated chronic humoral rejection, we call it as. Glomerulonephritis, either recurrent or de novo, like I said, either some form of glomerulonephritis like MPGN and IgA usually recur later than 3 months post-transplant. Calcineurin toxicity, usually dose related, is seen in this range where decreasing the calcineurin according to your levels. When I say calcineurin, I mean both cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So decreasing the dose of that can lead to improvement in the renal function. Obstruction, late obstructions are usually ureteric obstructions. Late, you will worry always about the BK virus, particularly in view of the increasing incidence of BK virus viremia as well as BK virus nephropathy. Obstruction of the ureter is important to remember. Other causes could be surgical in nature, and because as you all aware, the lower end of the ureter is, the blood supply is always precarious. So depending on how the transplant went, whether to expect any problems at that end. Viral infections. So the important ones are CMV and BK virus nephritis. And the last one is herpes. Basically herpes zoster and simplex as well, causing shingles. Transplant artery stenosis. Now this is a very important complication for us to remember. It can be either of donor-derived reasons, or it can be from recipient or from technical problems. A renal artery narrowing in a transplant will manifest with, so this is like the Goldblatt single kidney model. When Goldblatt has two models for renal artery hypertension, you may be aware. So when there is a single kidney with a single artery, so single functioning kidney with an artery, and if there is a narrowing of that artery, it will present with hypertension in what way? Salt and water retention. So these patients will get swollen with worsening edema, worsening hypertension, and renal failure. So that is the way it will present. When there are two kidneys and two arteries, and of which one is narrowed, the increased pressure is reflected on the other kidney, causing natriuresis, and they don't get so much of swelling. But that is for another day. In a transplant, it's only single kidney and single artery. So the renal artery stenosis will manifest as salt and water retention, increased edema, increased hypertension, and a dysfunction. Management is usually in the form of radiological management, in the sense that we call interventional radiology to fix it whenever it is fixable. Reanastomosis is pretty difficult, as you are all aware, and only in cases where radiology cannot help us are we going to attempt it. Chronic allograft nephropathy is like a basket diagnosis. It includes kidney dysfunction from both immunologic as well as non-immunologic causes. So when I say immunologic, I mean cellular as well as humoral rejection. And when I say non-immunologic, it is all other factors like donor-derived factors, donor age, donor hypertension, donor comorbidities, cold ischemia times, all of those basket case, like I call it. And even your metabolic things like hypertension, diabetes in the recipient, hypertension in the recipient, hyperlipidemia in the recipient, kidney stones in the recipient, everything can lead to kidney dysfunction causing chronic allograft nephropathy. So it's a basket diagnosis. Okay. Let us speak about some of the specific ones a bit in detail. Acute rejection, usually within first 6 months. After 6 months, it is because of development of de novo DSA. So de novo means new, which was not there before the transplant. It has formed new. It could be the HLA or non-HLA antibody, usually seen in patients where vigorous withdrawal of immunosuppression, overconfidence in withdrawing the immunosuppression. There's no real test to tell you how much of immunosuppression is adequate. So there's no one test that you can do. We can do drug levels, we can do biochemistry, we can do clinical monitoring. There's no one test to tell us whether we are doing enough or we're doing more than enough. So it's a tightrope walk, and there's no perfect way to do it even now. So when you kind of undershoot and you're giving less medicines than required, then immunological response, the effector arm can take over and make antibodies and cause rejection. So most patients can be asymptomatic, and usually an acute rejection is suggested by an increasing in the creatinine. In severe rejections, you will see fever, high BP, graft tenderness, oliguria. But that is when suddenly somebody is stopping his drugs or they get a very severe antibody-mediated rejection. You are going to see all this. 99% of your patients are going to have only a slight rise in creatinine as an early manifestation of acute rejections. Renal imaging is quite non-specific. Pritam, I will call you. Renal imaging is fairly non-specific. The sonography will show an increase in the kidney size, loss of the corticomedullary junction, prominent pyramids, and a decreased echogenicity of the renal sinus. When you do a Doppler, it will show you increased RIs or increased resistive indices within the kidney. Rejection is classified as hyperacute, acute, late acute, and chronic. Hyperacute means on the table. within minutes. So they are always because you missed, or one of your tests for the antibodies went wrong, or something really went wrong, because you are not able to detect antibodies when you should have, and that leads to hyperacute rejection. Acute rejection is usually within around 7 days to first few weeks, and like I told you, it is the response of the effector arm of the immunity by cellular immunity predominantly. So acute cellular rejection is a commoner form of rejection in this period of time. Late acute after 3 months is when antibody production goes up and de novo DSAs come in picture, and chronic humoral rejection is a commoner form of rejection at this point. Chronic rejection is because of the low-grade antibody formation, which leads to a chronic antibody-mediated injury to the kidney, causing acute chronic rejection, which is over months to multiple years. So this is what you never want to see, hyperacute rejection with the kidney appearing blue on the table. And if you do a biopsy, you're going to see widespread vascular thrombosis, and these thrombi will usually need a nephrectomy in the same operation. So this is how your hyperacute rejection looks with all intravascular thrombi and endothelitis on the biopsy. Okay. So this is how the histopath of the hyperacute rejection looks like. Prominent neutrophil infiltration, fibrinoid necrosis, interstitial hemorrhage, and neutrophilic migration. And you're going to see a fibrin thrombus and afferent arteriolar thrombus has been shown here. And the peritubular capillaries will show C4 deposition after 48 to 72 hours. But usually most of us will end up removing these kidneys on the same table. In acute accelerated, you are likely to see the PTC C4D depositions. When you say rejection, you say T cell rejection or B cell rejection. Now T cell rejection is cell mediated. So it is CD4 and CD8 T cell infiltrates. They'll manifest, the earliest manifestation is a form of tubulitis, which is interstitial inflammation extending into the tubule by injury to the tubular basement membrane. Interstitial infiltrates and tubulitis are not specific of T cell mediated rejection. Sometimes you can see changes of tubulitis in certain viral infections, pyelonephritis, PTLD also. It is not pure T cells. Even in T cell mediated rejection, some degree of B cells, eosinophils, macrophages may be present. This is how a T cell rejection looks like. Basically, disruption of the tubular basement membrane with interstitial inflammation, intimal arteritis, patchy mononuclear infiltrates without tubulitis is not uncommon. Neutrophils are uncommon, and usually when you see a lot of neutrophils, you should think of an antibody-mediated rejection. Treatment, ideally we should have a biopsy before treating rejection. Whether or not we should treat the subclinical and borderline acute rejection is open to discussion, but most of us would agree to treat it. We really don't want it to become clinical and significant. Initial treatment is in the form of corticosteroids. Normally a short pulse of a corticosteroid followed by increasing the maintenance dose of steroid is usual treatment. When it is not responding to steroids, it is called a steroid refractory rejection, in which case lymphocyte depleting antibodies or OKT3 can be used. Also, patients with recurrent acute cellular rejection, you might want to use a lymphocyte depleting antibody for this. If a patient has a rejection, then it's better to switch from azathioprine to mycophenolate, or from vice versa. If they are not on azathioprine or mycophenolate, then you add mycophenolate to them. That is the recommendation. The next kind of rejection we talk about is the antibody-mediated rejection, which causes graft dysfunction. It is seen commonly in the early phase. Graft dysfunction because of antibody-mediated rejection is because of preformed antibodies. So preformed antibodies means which were present even before the transplant. Even though your cross-match was negative, the antibodies were there. They were just in low dose, so you could not pick them up. The manifestation is in the form of neutrophils in the peritubular capillaries with endothelial arteritis. Tubulitis is not a common manifestation. You can look for DSA when you are suspecting antibody-mediated rejection. Both class 1, class 2 can be seen. Typically, it occurs in the first week post-transplant, and initial graft function is usually not bad, but the presentation is usually in the form of severe, in the sense the patient can have fever, oliguria, and a drop in output with a rising creatinine. That's how usually they will manifest in the early post-transplant course. If you biopsy them, you will either see a thrombotic microangiopathy or a TMA, or you will see some form of peritubular capillitis. When you look for C4D, it will be present. C4D, what I showed you yesterday, is the something like a mark that is left when the antibody injury to the endothelium is present. How do you treat a case of antibody-mediated rejection? Two things: you need drugs to decrease the antibody production, and you need mechanisms to remove the antibodies. Excuse me one second. So, sorry. So, antibody-mediated rejection. So, treatment is in the form of two things. Like I said, antibody removal. Commonest way we do it is by doing plasma exchange. Other mechanisms would be to use immunoadsorption or IVIG. Reduce the antibody production is so decrease the B cell function. Mechanisms can be rituximab or an anti-CD20 antibody, IVIG or IV immunoglobulin. It can work by a lot of mechanisms to both, kind of neutralize the antibodies in the circulation as well as decrease the B cell response. Splenectomy can be used in refractory rejections because most of the B cells are kind of sequestrated there. Anti-plasma. So as I mentioned to you, once a plasma cell is formed, then your rituximab is not going to work against it. Or your IVIG doesn't work very well against plasma cells. It does a bit, but not very well. The best drug is bortezomib or Velcade, which is coming from the literature of multiple myeloma. It has great anti-plasma cell activity. Whenever you are treating a severe rejection, remember that T cell is ultimately used by B cells to mediate the effector response. So T cell depleting agents can also be used. Higher dose TAC regimens have been used in treatment of antibody-mediated rejection. Eculizumab is very expensive, but since it blocks the final injury pathway, which is mediated usually by the complements. So, after your antibody has bound to whatever it wanted to bind to, the mechanism of destruction is manifested at the level of the complement. So if you have a complement pathway inhibitor like eculizumab or anti-C5a antibody, it can just block the response, irrespective of what your antibody is doing. But then, like I said, it is prohibitively expensive and very infrequently used, not available in our country right now. So what we do in practice is we do plasma exchange followed by rituximab. In very refractory cases, we have even used splenectomy and bortezomib. These are the different ways to block the B cell. So our B cell inhibition by using drugs like rituximab or IVIG. Then you can deplete the plasma cells by using drugs like bortezomib. Antibodies which are already in circulation can be removed by plasma exchange or IVIG. And if the antibody is still functioning, you can use something like eculizumab and just block the complement to prevent the damage to the endothelial cells. These are different ways of blocking the function. And IVIG, like I said, it can work at all levels. Doesn't work so well on plasma cells, but different mechanisms can be used to block the humoral response. IVIG, like I said, it can work in a myriad ways. It can neutralize the antibodies. It can inhibit the complements. It can inhibit CD19 expression on the activated B cells. It can reduce apoptosis of B cells. It can bind to the Fc gamma receptors on the other cells like macrophage, neutrophils, platelets, mast cell, non-killer cells. And IVIG can block all these mechanisms that effectively injure the endothelial cells, causing rejection. How do you treat antibody-mediated rejection? We biopsy them first, and we should treat borderline as well as subclinical if it is an antibody-mediated rejection. So you should give steroid if they are not on steroids. The treatment will form, one or more of the following alternatives: plasma exchange, IVIG, rituximab, and orally. In last would be adding a lymphocyte depleting antibody to mitigate the T cell injury, which will come as because of B cell stimulation. Once you have a humoral rejection, these are the patients where you should not think of decreasing the immunosuppression early. You should leave them on high doses of immunosuppression to prevent a second rejection episode. And again, high dose TAC, high dose MMF is recommended in these patients along with steroids. But after the rejection, the other thing I would like to touch upon a bit is on infections. So infections, this is the commonest chart that you will see when it comes to looking for infections in post-transplant situation. So less than 1 month, 1 to 6 months, and more than 6 months. So less than 1 month are usually the either donor-derived infections or pre-existing in the recipient or surgical acquired nosocomial infections. 1 to 6 months are usually for the CMV, PCP, and tuberculosis in our country. More than 6 months are the common infections that any of us can face, like a UTI or a community-acquired pneumonia. And the important ones in transplant setting would be CMV, HSV, BKV. Those would be the important ones to remember. CMV deserves mention. It's one of the infections which is becoming very important post-transplant. It's HHV5 family. It's the most common opportunistic infection after transplants. It is in kidneys. Actually, the risk is lowest as compared to other solid organs. CMV disease in 30 to 78% of recipients if they are not given prophylaxis. So it's very high mortality if untreated. Effect of CMV causes a lot of problems. CMV disease affects bone marrow and multiple organs, including heart, liver, lungs, pancreas, colon. Different places it will manifest with different presentations. It can also damage the kidney and cause nephritis. Also remember that CMV causes active systemic immunosuppression and it leads to other opportunistic infections, both bacterial and viral, becoming more common in these patients. So CMV is bad. Terms, like important things to remember are asymptomatic CMV. So CMV previously what we used to do, CMV IgG and IgM to look for exposure. And we used to always think, oh, IgG is old exposure, IgM is new. If IgM is present and IgG is negative, it means it's a new CMV infection. With the introduction of PP65, which was the CMV antigen which can be detected in the serum, the focus changed to looking for CMV antigenemia. Then when PCR became commonplace and CMV DNA was easy to do, all these previous tests have little value today. You can just do CMV, DNA, PCR, quantitative, and straight away you can say whether the patient has an active CMV infection or not. Samples commonly used are blood, urine, buffy coat, and throat swabs. Primary CMV infection and secondary. Primary is when it is not present in the recipient but present in the donor. Secondary means it is a latent infection which has become active now, or usually a reactivation. CMV can be symptomatic or asymptomatic. When it is mild, it is usually in the form of a CMV syndrome with fever, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, and increased CMV titer. When it is invasive, it is a CMV disease, manifests with bone marrow involvement and organ involvement. So sometimes, in the eyes, there are classic signs of CMV on the fundus, the flame-shaped hemorrhages that we see, pneumonitis, hepatitis, colitis. So you can get CMV ulcers when you do endoscopy, and the biopsy actually shows CMV intracellularly. Enteritis, involvement of the graft itself. You can do a kidney biopsy and demonstrate CMV infection. Risk factors would be high doses of immunosuppression, mismatching for the donor and recipient. By mismatching, I mean that the donor is already having a CMV exposure and the recipient is CMV naive. Less common but not impossible, particularly in pediatric transplants. And in this situation, using the prophylaxis is almost mandatory with valganciclovir, which is now the standard of care. So this is what I was talking about when I mentioned pre-infection, reactivation, and superinfection. Diagnosis of CMV infection, like I said, histopathology is absolutely the gold standard previously, but now with serology, particularly PCR becoming common, viral load testing by PCR has become the standard of care. Viral culture is hardly used except in research labs. Serology in form of IgG, IgM is not so important now. Histopathology is important because it is a too invasive CMV once you diagnose it on histopath. So this is how the CMV cell looks like. It's like a target cell in the inside the. So viral cultures, like I said, it is primarily used in research. We don't really use it for clinical practice. CMV, IgG, IgM, I told you, IgM, particularly fourfold increase in the IgG or a markedly positive IgM will be a marker of a recent infection. can be used for screening, but less useful for diagnosis of CMV disease. This is the PP65 antigen, which I mentioned to you, which we used to use before the DNA PCR became commonplace. This is how the antigen was looked at in the for diagnosis. PCR, like we said, 90% reduction in viral load after therapy for CMV infection. You know that the treatment is working. Patients, if the CMV titer is not coming down with ganciclovir, then you will label it as primarily ganciclovir resistant. Even at 2 weeks, if there is no response, and then you will use drugs other than ganciclovir in these patients. How to prevent CMVs? You look, there's a role for prophylaxis. The common what we use nowadays is the universal prophylaxis, where we just started in the first days and continue it for approximately 100 days post-transplant. Where affordability is a problem, you can also use preemptive therapy, which by mean you just keep on checking every week or 2 weeks, and as and when PCR becomes positive, you start treatment. But you do it before the patient develops CMV disease. Okay. Otherwise, once it's organ invasive, it's very difficult for the patient. This is what is done in preemptive strategy, where they do weekly CMV PCRs for the first 4 months, and anytime the PCR shows more than 2,000 copies, they would immediately start treating with valganciclovir. So if you use prophylaxis, or there are some benefits and there are some problems. The benefits with prophylaxis are that that documented fewer opportunistic infections, better graft survival, etc. has been documented. But the cost is there, the risk of late CMV disease is there, and drug costs definitely go up, and side effects of valganciclovir in the form of bone marrow suppression is something that we all have to deal with, particularly because MMF is standard of care now, right? CMV prophylaxis for at least first 3 months post-transplant is recommended. Treatment of CMV disease, once the standard of care is IV ganciclovir, and if it is resistant, you can use other drugs like foscarnet. So this is what can be used: IV ganciclovir 5 mg per kg 12 hours for 2 to 3 weeks, or oral ganciclovir 900 mg twice a day for 21 days. Last virus that I would like to discuss is the polyoma or the BK virus. So the important terms here are BK viruria, which is present in 30 to 40% if you were to do a screening. Decoy cells in the urine are classic, which are present in 20 to 30%. BK viremia, or diagnosed in the blood, is 10 to 20%. BK nephropathy is 0 to 10%, and graft loss because of BKV is 0 to 5%. Polyoma virus is a DNA virus. Most of us are exposed to it already. It has a special affinity for the urogenital tract, and that is where it is usually found. So patients with old age, immunosuppressed state, the manifestations can usually in the form of hemorrhagic cystitis, ureteral obstruction, ureteral stenosis, manifestations. So most of the times it is actually asymptomatic. Sometimes it will present with ureteral pathology or interstitial cystitis, like we mentioned. It usually presents in the form of interstitial nephritis, BKV nephropathy, and the graft loss in this is very high, 10 to 80%. The management is actually primarily reduction of the immunosuppression. No specific antivirals really work. We stop the antiproliferative, the BK, the MMF, or the azathioprine. We usually treat with substituting with a leflunomide, and quinolones are used as common therapy. Other drugs like cidofovir are very nephrotoxic. We use them less commonly, but they are the other options available. Okay, so I have already explained these concepts to you. Viruria, decoy cells, viremia, which are important in BK virus nephritis. Who are the patients at risk? Older age, males, diabetics, and who are BK virus naive prior to transplantation. Higher use of immunosuppression or treatment of rejections can lead to increased incidence of BK virus. Viral subtypes are present. We'll not get into that. Commonly they can manifest as a co-infection with CM, and it can become very difficult to treat. Major risk factors: over immunosuppression. Definitive diagnosis: histopath, yes, possible. More importantly, immunohistochemistry. Previously, when PCR was not available easily, we used to use antibodies against SV40 antigen. Now that being said, now with the availability of the PCR, Urine as well as serum as well as tissue can be screened for BK virus. PCR can be sent. Histopathology, decoy cells in the urine are very important. It's a non-expensive way of screening, particularly when cost is an issue. Or BK viral inclusions in the intrarenal cells, in the renal cells can be hallmark of BK virus nephritis. So decoy cells, BKV DNA in the urine and BKV in the blood. So that is how you look at for it. Plasma BKV DNA more than 10,000, positive predictive value of 50 to 85%. Decoy cells, negative predictive value is very good, but positive predictive value is not so good. Urine BKV PCR, again, this is to presence of, suppose you have BKV in the urine. Does the patient always have nephropathy? 2 of 3 times he has, 1 on 3 times he does not. These are how the decoy cells look like in the urine. A large nucleus with a single large basophilic internuclear inclusion. That is a decoy cell. These are the important viruses post-transplant that we spoke about. Histopathologic patterns, we already told you that interstitial nephritis, interstitial cystitis are the important ones. Particularly BK virus and rejection should not be confused because the treatment of two are diagonally opposite. In rejection, you want to give more immunosuppression. In BK virus, you want to reduce the immunosuppression. Both can manifest with rising creatinine. So it is very important to diagnose BK nephritis in such situations. Screening is recommended first 3 to 6 months, and then every 3 monthly till the end of 2 years. Whenever there is an unexplained rise in creatinine, we should look for BK virus in the urine and the blood. Modification to reduce the immunosuppression is the key. All antiproliferative as well as calcineurin, you need to reduce the dose. There is no specific treatment, but like I told you, leflunomide can be used as an antipyrimidine drug. Cidofovir, quinolones, IVIG have been used without any specific. There's no real large database that can help us tell what to do. Okay. So this is what I would like to explain at the moment. And I suppose that's where I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to take any questions should there be about the entire topic.
Okay. Rishi, I have got some questions. Number one, there are 4 different cases when you will recommend transplant. One is if the patient is HIV positive recipient. Second is in cases of tuberculosis, if it is there in a recipient. Third is if the recipient had a bilateral renal malignancy and bilateral nephrectomy has been done. And the last is malignancy anywhere in the body which has been treated and cured. So these are the 4 cases, whether you recommend transplant in this patient, and if yes, when?
Okay, so I'm going to take it one by one, sir. So first part is transplant in HIV positive patients. So there are guidelines for recommending HIV positive recipient to be transplanted. They need to be stable on a stable heart regimen, and ideally you should withdraw drugs in the heart which have interaction with calcineurin inhibitors. So once they are stable on their heart and the CD4 count is more than 200 and the patient does not have any opportunistic infection in the last 2 years, these are the patients with HIV who can be taken for kidney transplant. I personally have transplanted 4 patients with HIV positive patients so far, of which 2 are doing well and 2 have not done so well. The tricky things to understand are, even though we think as HIV as immunocompromised patients, actually the incidence of rejection is higher in these patients. The other tricky and important thing is to adjust the level of the calcineurin inhibitor, cyclosporin as well as tacrolimus. So we should actually try and adjust the level early before transplant. So even when before the patient has been transplanted, you give the cyclosporin or the tacrolimus, you come to a dose which is fairly stable and with a drug level which is stable, and only then you put the kidney in, is what I learned. And so these 2 are very important. You should not take them as immunocompromised patients because they mount bad rejections, and you need to be on a stable drug regimen, and you cannot play a lot with the drugs. Otherwise your levels will fluctuate a lot post-transplantation. The problem comes when they have an issue like a rejection or an infection and they require a drug change. That is when usually things start going downhill. The second question you asked, sir, was tuberculosis in the recipient. So tuberculosis in the recipient is fairly common in our patients who are waiting for a kidney transplant. So the guideline is that it should not be an MDR TB. Number one. Number two is patient should be started on an anti-tuberculous regimen for at least 4 to 6 weeks prior to transplantation, and there should be some clinical as well as radiological resolution of the TB before you proceed ahead with the transplantation. Post-transplant, you will need to continue the anti-TB medicines for 9 to 12 months. So the induction phase actually should be over and the rifampicin should ideally be withdrawn pre-transplant, because then the transplant becomes much easier to deal with. Because as we all know, rifampicin is an enzyme inducer and the level of drugs required is very high, and the cost will go up manyfold if we start using rifampicin in our transplant recipients. That was TB. The third question you asked was in patient who has a renal cell or a kidney cancer requiring bilateral nephrectomies, when would we transplant? So there has to be a tumor-free survival for at least 2 years before you recommend transplant to these patients. That is the guideline. At which point you can consider doing a PET and documenting that there is no recurrence and you can go ahead with the transplant. With other malignancies not involving the kidney, the guidelines are similar. At least 2 years of tumor-free survival with no recurrence. And actually it's different from different malignancies, like malignancies which are known to recur more aggressively. The recommendation would be to wait even for 5 years. But most practically, you would wait for at least 2 years before you go ahead and transplant these patients. I hope that answers it, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice answer.
So
Can
there are
can you?
questions.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Dr. Jai Joshi asks, what is the most common protocol used and steroid withdrawal duration?
So Jay, thanks for that. Steroid withdrawal and steroid avoidance are two concepts that we need to understand. Steroid avoidance means no steroids at all at the time of transplant. So here the protocol used is to use a strong induction agent, either a rabbit antithymocyte globulin or a Campath. And along with that, use dual immunosuppression where you use higher doses of tacrolimus and MMF usually, or higher doses of cyclosporin and MMF, and you avoid using the steroid altogether. You need to choose your patients carefully and wisely. These should be patients who should not be sensitized. They should have a low PRA less than 20, and they should not have any antibodies, anti-HLA antibodies in their blood, either on flow cross match or Luminex prior to transplantation. So in low risk transplants, you can go ahead with steroid-free immunosuppression. Advantages are particularly diabetic recipients. The sugar fluctuations post-transplant are much easier to manage. Number one. Number two is steroid side effects. The entire list which I showed you, you can avoid all of them. You should have a lower threshold for regular blood test in these patients. And if you detect any acute rejection, it should be detected early. And that time you should reconsider restarting steroid in these patients if you did a steroid avoidance. Steroid withdrawal is different. Steroid withdrawal means you use steroids for a period of time and then you withdraw it. So when you use it only for the first week and withdraw it, is usually possible to get away without major side effects. So you use steroid for the first 5-7 days and just stop it abruptly. And that usually works well. But when you try to withdraw steroids after using it for 2-3 months in a gradual fashion, that is when you're more likely to get into rejection as compared to, say, leaving the patient on 5 mg of steroid. I hope that explains it, Jay.
Yes, sir. Next question is how to choose between cyclosporin and tacrolimus by Dr. Arshad.
That's interesting. Actually, the world is going to tacrolimus for convenience, because tacrolimus is just easier to use in the form that the drug level is a trough level and not a peak level. See, the logistics of actually drawing that blood sample at 120 minutes after the dose is very difficult in a practical situation. There's a gap of 5 minutes on each side that they give to draw the blood sample. It becomes very difficult for the patient and the relatives on an ongoing basis to monitor the drug level. That's one thing. That being said, cyclosporin had its positives. It was less nephrotoxic. causes less post-transplant diabetes mellitus. But now it is actually, with all the generics in our country, tacrolimus based regimens are actually much less expensive as compared to cyclosporin based regimens. So previously cyclosporin, so that is one of the reasons why I think we have all shifted to tacrolimus primarily as the main drug. I would still use cyclosporin when I'm concerned about post-transplant diabetes and also in hepatitis C positive. That still remains one of the clear indications for using cyclosporin post-transplant. Hepatitis C positive recipient.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Next question by Dr. Arshad. Which antihypertensive is preferred in RAS in transplant patients?
Harshad, the answer should be, the question should have been which one not to use, because that is very important to remember. You should not use, because it's a single kidney with a renal artery stenosis. So it's an absolute contraindication to use as an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker. So do not use any drug that blocks the renin-angiotensin pathway. Okay, so if you cannot do structural treatment of the renal artery stenosis, if you're going to live with it, the safest drug would be vascular vasodilators or calcium channel blockers.
Okay, sir. Dr. Siddhivinayak has a question. What are drug shifting commonly used in practice and indications for it? Example, tacrolimus to cyclosporin or CNI to mTOR inhibitors. Like that.
Yes, actually the answer is going to be pretty long there, but it's a case-to-case basis. I will just say that briefly. Like, what I mean is sometimes you use patient on tacrolimus and they are having this uncommon mutation where you don't get tacrolimus drug levels in the good range in spite of giving optimum dose. And that is one reason to switch. The other is the other extreme where on very low doses of the drug, you see a very high plasma level and then you need to switch because of toxicity. Sometimes uncommon side effects creep in the form of TMA, where you need to shift. Sometimes a patient has a calcineurin toxicity on a biopsy, where you will switch from a calcineurin to an mTOR. That is usually when best recommended when the creatinine is still less than 2 and the proteinuria is less than 1 gram. That is where you are going to get maximum benefits. Sometimes a patient gets a CMV disease or a BK nephritis, and then you need to withdraw your antiproliferative. And in that case, instead of using TAC-MMF, you'll use tacrolimus or you'll use TAC with low-dose sirolimus. So these would be various hypothetical scenarios I can think about where I would switch classes of drugs.
Okay.
A lot of them, but I mean, it would be impossible to cover all the possible scenarios.
Yes, sir. So that's it, sir. No more questions.
Sure.
Gaurangsha, sir?
Yeah, the last question. When you are suspecting rejection, like, how fast you will act on that?
Sir, I will act on it almost immediately. See, what happens is whenever, rejection, like I told, in 9 out of 10 patients, you're just going to see a rise in creatinine. So now in the early post-transplant period, when you see a rise in creatinine, the first things you need to do, make sure that it is not a surgical issue. So you need to have a look at the kidney, make sure the hydronephrosis is not there, make sure that the renal artery and vein are patent and there is no structural problem there. So that's why you would always see us asking for a sonography quickly. So once the sonography shows that the anatomical problem is not there, there's no lymphocyte, there's no obstruction, there is no renal artery or vein disease, then the second thing we'll think about is it calcineurin toxicity? So what are the drug levels? Is there any neurologic toxicity? Is there any worsening hypertension? Is there any uncommon side effect like a thrombotic microangiopathy that we can think about? All those things are ruled out. The primary kidney disease pre-transplant is not recurring early, particularly in cases like FSGS. That once those have been ruled out, then it is important to think of rejection and treat early, because rejections respond better if you treat them early. If you treat them late, the same rejections are more refractory to treatment.
So even if you, for example, if you are suspecting, then even before taking a biopsy or proving, you start your treatment for the rejection?
Sir, unless it's a high risk scenario where suppose, patient has had a previous BK nephritis Now here you don't want to use excessive immunosuppression because otherwise, you'll land up into a problem. So those are cases where you will do a biopsy first and then treat the rejection. But 9 out of 10 times when there is a low risk scenario where BK virus or CMV disease is not on the cards, you will just go ahead with pulse the steroid and do the biopsy the next day.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Tanvi,
Yes.
any more question? Dr.
No,
Gita
sir,
is
no
there?
more. Sir, Gite sir has, I think, lost signal, or I can't see him on the panel anymore.
Okay, okay. Anyway, I would like to thank Rushi. It is a fantastic lecture you have given. So many doubts you have cleared, and I'm sure that all our PG students have understood quite a lot, and we have recorded also, so they can go through it again and again, and I'm sure it will be very beneficial to them in their exam. So once again, I thank you,
So,
Ruchi. Yeah,
I'm
Tanvi.
really sorry to interrupt. One more question had just come in the chat box. If last question, sir can just answer it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
Dr. Siddhivinayak is asking, what will be your approach if BK virus infection and rejection occurs simultaneously?
Wow, it's fantastic. Uh, Not like it is not an impossible scenario. It actually happens in practice. Normally, you will think, that BK virus happens in over immunosuppression. So if patient is already over immunosuppressed, why is the patient rejecting at the same time? So logically, you will think that they should not happen together. That being said, they do happen, particularly because you see a BKV and you reduce the immunosuppression and you reduce it below the threshold because there is no one test to tell you what is the right level, and you also land up with a rejection. And now what are you going to do? So these are the drugs. These are the patients where you will withdraw the MMF and put them on leflunomide and try IVIG. So you will basically use drugs like leflunomide and IVIG, which are both anti-rejection as well as anti-BKV. But there is no perfect answer to your question because it's a very tricky scenario, and most of the time these patients are going to lose their kidneys. That's an unfortunate truth as of now.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, Gauranga
Thank
sir.
you.
Sorry.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, Hiren, if please any comments you want to make. Hello, Hiren.
So it was an excellent presentation. I think you've already said it, sir, that it will be really beneficial to all our PGs.
Sure.
And this is what we had expected from Rushi, sir. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
and even my many pandas are clear now. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Lot
No,
of
sir.
efforts.
Thanks to all of you, sir, for giving me this opportunity to interact with this August group. And I'm very happy to do it for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Good
Bye.
night. Good night, everybody.
Good night, sir.